Good evening. My name is Martha Torrey, and I'm a member of the Board of Directors of Sunnybrook Health Sciences Center. It is my pleasure to welcome you to this month's Speaker Series event. We are very excited about tonight's talk, which is focused on climate change and your health. Before we begin, I would like to take this opportunity to say that at Sunnybrook, our mission is to care for patients and their families when it matters most. Sunnybrook also cares about our collective responsibility to achieve reconciliation with Indigenous peoples who have lived on this land for generations upon generations. We acknowledge our campuses are located on the treaty territory of the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation and ancestral and traditional lands of the Anishinaabe, Haudenosaunee, Ojibwe, Chippewa, and Huron-Wendat nations. Today, this land is home to many First Nations, Inuit, Métis, and urban Indigenous people from across Turtle Island. We value their contributions past and present, and we are grateful to work in the community on this territory. So why are we discussing climate change in your health? Well, according to our Health Canada, climate change is already affecting human health in both direct and indirect ways, and will continue to do so in the future. Natural disasters or hazards related to climate change, such as air pollution or heat waves, can have serious health effects, such as cardiovascular and respiratory diseases. We know that climate change also increases risks to mental health and well-being, and it is leading to myriad shifts in our natural environment that impact animal and, in turn, human health. At Sunnybrook, clinicians across the organization's many care programs see these effects up close. Whether family doctors caring for the elderly as part of the Integrated Community Program, or psychiatrists with the Hurvitz Brain Sciences Program treating patients with mood disorders, or clinician scientists working at the hospital and the Sunnybrook Research Institute. Our experts understand the physical, social, and psychological impacts of climate change on health and what can be done to help people cope. The dynamic lineup of speakers you will hear from this evening will address some key questions, including which groups are most at risk of the health impacts of climate change and how might that inform prevention. What impact does climate change have on mental health and how can we help? And how do changes to our natural environment and animal health also impact humans? In addition to our panelists, we are fortunate to have Jenny Ying moderating this event. Jenny is the Manager of Quality and Patient Safety at Sunnybrook, where she oversees accreditation preparations for the organization and leads quality improvement initiatives. She previously worked as a respiratory therapist caring for critically ill patients. In addition, Jenny is co-chair of Sunnybrook's Green Task Force. Her passion for sustainability sparked when she read about the global decline in bee populations and their impact on food security, which led her to bring beehives to Sunnybrook. Through her work with the Green Task Force, Jenny is committed to spearheading sustainable change to clinical processes and supply management and raising awareness for a sustainable health system. This is just a snapshot of Jenny's biography. As you can see, we are in excellent hands having her moderate tonight's panel discussion. Jenny, thank you so much for being here. I'll now pass the microphone and event over to you.
Thank you so much, Martha, for that introduction. And hello to all of you joining us here today to learn about climate change and your health. What are we referring to when we discuss health in the context of climate change? Well, as you will hear, a warming planet significantly impacts our health. It affects our ability to breathe during poor air quality events like wildfires, stay cool during extreme weather events such as heat waves, and maintain peace of mind as we witness these events unfold around us. Climate change is a growing source of health-related concerns and anxiety for many Canadians. The good news is there are steps we can take to adapt and guard against these negative health impacts of climate change. I'm eager to learn about these strategies during our talk this evening. We have a stellar lineup of speakers for you. First, Dr. Regine Mehta will provide an overview of how extreme weather, such as heat events, how it impacts our bodies and why this is concerning for the elderly. He'll also offer some tips on how to stay safe. Next, many of us will have heard the phrase climate anxiety, but what does it actually mean? Dr. Anthony Levitt will discuss what climate change anxiety is, who it affects, and most importantly, what we can do about it. Finally, Dr. Samira Mubaraka will share her expertise on what a warming planet means for virus and disease transmission and the ways in which animal and human health are interconnected. There's so much to discuss, and we'll set aside some time at the end for you to ask our speaker some questions. Thank you to everyone who has already submitted a question online. Feel free to also send your questions to their speaker series webpage while the presentations are happening. We may not be able to get to every question, but we will do our best in the time we have available. So let's begin the lectures. I would like to introduce you to our first speaker. Dr. Regine Mehta is a geriatrician and general internal medicine specialist who has worked at Sunnybrook for over 30 years. Dr. Mehta enjoys caring for older patients with complex medical issues. He is the former head of Sunnybrook's Division of Geriatric Medicine, a position he has held for 2 decades, and is part of a team helping to design the Peter Cipriano Center for Senior Health. In addition to his enormous contributions at Sunnybrook, Dr. Mehta is the Geriatric Medicine Section Head for the Ontario Medical Association. We want to offer a special thanks to Dr. Mehta for joining us this evening and filling in on very short notice for Dr. Susan Deering, who had planned to take part in this event, but unfortunately could not be here tonight. Regine, thank you for joining the panel to share your wealth of expertise with us, and I'll send it over to you.
All right, thanks very much. And yes, it is a last-minute substitution, but happy to take part in this talk tonight. Quite excited about this. So we are going to talk about climate change and seniors, and I'm just going to go to the next slide and make a few disclosures. First, I'm actually not a climate activist, and I also have no relation to the energy sector. But I think I have a reasonable amount of common sense, and so I actually am concerned about the environment generally, but also how it will affect our health. I'll just take a moment to actually thank an emergency physician who I recently heard a lecture from on this topic, Joe Vipon, who works in Calgary. And he's one of the leaders of a physician group, actually, Canadian Association of Physicians for the Environment. And I'll reference that at the end. That has a lot more information than I'm going to give the next 10 minutes or so about how this can affect your health. And so this is a huge concern. So I just was asked to join this yesterday. And so this morning I was thinking, well, what should I say today? And as I start my day normally, we'll go to the next slide. This was one of the headlines in this morning's Globe and Mail, and it says India issues heat wave alert as Delhi posts record high temperature, and they go on to describe temperatures are going to reach 50 degrees. And so one might say, well, geez, India's a hot country. That's a long way away. What could that have to do? I live in Toronto. We're in Canada. Why do we need to be concerned about something happening the other side of the world? So that was this morning. So this next slide here came on my cell phone last week. And as you can see, there was an emergency alert, which initially was like an Amber Alert. And I thought, oh dear, there'll be another sort of child that has disappeared. But no, it was actually for a tornado. And this actually occurred, I was just an hour from Sunnybrook, north from here, and that was at 1:59 last Wednesday. And there was yet another one at 9 o'clock that night. So here I am, here in Ontario, and there's a tornado warning. And as you can see, it said, take immediate cover in basement or interior room. I'm going, oh dear. And so, as you've already heard the term already, climate or eco-anxiety. Well, I was experiencing a little bit of that myself because I'm not used to getting tornado warnings. And hopefully Dr. Levitt, who's going to speak next, is going to provide some tips for me as to how to handle this sort of stuff. So that's local as well. All right, so I'll go to the next slide. And we'll say, what are the health impacts of climate change? And to be fair, although I'm a geriatrician and we're going to speak towards seniors, this affects people of all ages, although as we'll talk about, seniors are more at risk. And so there's direct connection between air pollution and cardiovascular disease. Not surprisingly, air pollution creates respiratory disease. But one of the big concerns about this part of it is that there's a term we talk about, particulate matter, less than 2.5 microns. And that's matter in various types of pollution, wildfires, etc. That's so small, it goes into your lungs, through the cells in the lungs and into your bloodstream, and then it can get to every organ in your body. And so that is a big deal. It's not just lung disease. Then there's issues around general organ dysfunction with heat stroke. So we can handle cold temperatures a little better. We obviously want to avoid hypothermia, and you can drop your temperature. Eventually, it becomes a big deal. But just a few degrees of temperature elevation creates much more grief for cells in many, many organs. And so we worry about both, but we worry more about minor change or like minimal changes in temperature going up. This can lead to cancer, air pollution. There's lots of things that are known to be carcinogenic. Of course, UV radiation with changes that we're experiencing can lead to skin cancer specifically. A trauma can occur, both physical trauma from various, calamities that go on around the world, drowning, flooding, etc. Malnutrition, food and water shortages. There's socioeconomic impacts, loss of property or income due to climate change can lead to changes in health because we're well aware that socioeconomic status correlates to health. Access to cooling spaces may depend on your socioeconomic status for heat waves, etc. Obviously, we're going to hear from the experts next around mental health and infectious diseases. So it really has a huge impact across the board. As I've said, I'm a geriatrician, and so really seniors are at greater risk from the effects of climate change from all these. We'll just do the next slide, and then we'll go to the next one after that. We'll go to the next slide now as well. So we're going to spend a bit of time talking about why is it that seniors are more at risk. And there's a lot to talk about. But in the short time, I thought I'd focus on just a couple of areas. We're going to spend a few minutes on physiology of aging. Another term we speak of in geriatrics is multimorbidity, that as people get older, they tend to collect a multitude of illnesses and they can interact with issues around climate change. Medications, of course, is a big issue. Food insecurity and displacement is a few things to talk about. So we'll go to the next slide. So talking about physiology first, and I'll spend most time on this. So as people get older, we talk about homeostatic reserve, or the opposite, homeostenosis. And what that means as people age is their ability to tolerate things out of the ordinary decreases. So for example, while it's not normal to fall as you get older, if you're walking along and happen to hit a curb or trip over a bump, you're maybe more likely to fall because your reserve to present that fall diminishes to a degree, whereas that's not necessarily true of a younger person. And so while I said falls aren't normal, there are other things that do occur with age. And so one of them is changes in thermoregulation. And so how we control heat and cold balance. And so there's a very small organ in part of the brain that's called the hypothalamus, and it has a very, very large role to play in how we control temperature. And as I mentioned, when that doesn't work right, there can be some aging changes and other brain diseases that can affect the hypothalamus. It can lead to changes in body temperature. And as I've mentioned, there's little tolerance for increase in body temperature coming changes, especially when they go up. Coming back to the first comment about homeostatic reserve, when we're out of our normal range, a younger person may not like it. An older person likes it a lot less and is way more prone to trouble when you're outside the usual range. We call that homeostenosis or loss of homeostatic reserve. We'll go to the next slide. So speaking of heat management, there are several ways the body can handle too much heat. Several of them are listed here. So evaporation, sweating is one that we're probably most familiar with, and that's a common event when people get overheated. The next several are radiation, and what that is, we just emit energy. So we radiate energy into the environment, and so we can reduce temperature. Conduction refers to when you touch or put next to a cooler surface, heat will go from your body to that cooler surface. And then convection refers to when air currents or water currents go past your body and they take heat away. And so those are the main ways we dissipate heat from our bodies. There's other issues around heat overproduction, but we won't get into that tonight. Go to the next slide. But what happens is that evaporation is the mainstay. So the other things I spoke about don't work very well at higher temperatures. So if your body's normally at 37 degrees and now the temperature goes up for whatever reason, you're at 40 degrees, but in India today it was going to be 50 degrees, you can't radiate heat into a warmer environment. Or if you're near a warmer surface, and you're also warmer than you are, convection doesn't work. So you're really left only with the opportunity to dissipate heat through evaporation. We'll go to the next slide. So what happens as you get older? Well, with age, that system doesn't work very well. That is simply just a function of age. but then you overlay other conditions. So there's just a few here. So with impaired cardiac function, for example, which is not an uncommon illness, it's harder to get blood flow to the skin and then have those blood vessels dilate to allow sweating to occur. So that can cause a problem. People are more prone to dehydration because as you get older, some people may find that their thirst center doesn't work as well. So it could be hot. People may not realize they need to drink because they don't perceive it like you did in younger years when you feel thirsty. So that can aggravate sweat or impair sweating because if you're dehydrated, you're not going to sweat as much. And then yet another example, various medications that people are on. And I've listed a particular class of medications called anticholinergic drugs, and won't get into the details there, except to say these could be drugs that might help with people with overactive bladder symptoms. Often they get prescribed in anticholinergic drugs. Gravol has very strong anticholinergic properties, so it's a very terrible drug for older people, and all of these things can impair evaporation. And when you have impaired evaporation and it's a hot day, your temperature goes up and you're at risk of heat stroke, etc. So that's one of the things that we'll be concerned about for older people in a warming global environment. We'll go to the next slide. So I mentioned multimorbidity before, and that's one of the syndromes we see in older people. Well, it's not just one issue. There are many things going on at the same time. And so there are certain systems that are more prone to dysfunction with an increase in temperature. And this can be aggravated by air pollution by, as I mentioned before, allowing these small particles through the lungs and into the blood, further aggravating various organs. As you can see, I've listed a couple of systems that are more prone to dysfunction with increasing temperature. The neurologic system, liver, cardiac, and renal are amongst the most prominent that become impaired. A clinical example might be someone with multiple sclerosis. When the temperature goes up, people can have a flare of that condition. People with stroke from the past, also with extreme temperatures, can have mild recurrences of their prior symptoms. So higher temperatures affect cellular function in these organs, and you can imagine these are pretty important organs, and so that can be a problem. And when people have many of these conditions at the same time, things start to go sour pretty quickly if you have multimorbidity, which is not uncommon. Next slide. So medications is a huge deal in our patient population. As people get older, they tend to have more illnesses and tend to get prescribed more medications. And so again, some of the class of medications that one would think about, the anticholinergic drugs, I mentioned some examples around Gravol, as I mentioned, drugs for bladder. Some of the medications that affect the brain can also do this. And as you can see, they can affect cognition. So you may not know what you're supposed to do when it's too warm. And they also impair sweating directly as they affect the blood flow at the skin. Many patients are on water pills or diuretics. And that can lead to dehydration. As I mentioned before, when you're dehydrated, you don't sweat as much, so you can't dissipate heat. I put up intravenous bags here, and you might go, well, what's that got to do with medications? And we often don't think about, well, it's the pills I take, but where are pills or delivery mechanisms made? So people may remember a hurricane somewhere around 2015. And what we saw after that is the availability of IV bags to deliver drugs for critical illness and beyond were primarily made in one factory in Puerto Rico. And when Puerto Rico was hit by a hurricane, suddenly there was a shortage of intravenous bags across North America because that was a major source to produce these to deliver medications, never mind the drug itself. So there's some indirect effects. We'll go to the next slide. So food insecurity is on people's minds for sure. And, you can say, well, I was at Loblaws today and the shelves seem pretty full. And so why would I be concerned? And the issue, as we are well aware of now, there's a global supply chain. These events, as I said, was a tornado warning just north of Toronto. And if you ever drive up the 400, you go through the Holland Marsh, it looks pretty nice there. Too much rain, not enough rain, there's local supply. Looking across to the prairies, obviously, there's a huge area where we get lots of food from, looking around the world. So global issues will affect our supply chain. Well, how might that affect, seniors? Rising prices affect all of us, and seniors are actually disproportionately affected by poverty. And so you might have to choose between paying for more expensive groceries or paying rent. And I can tell you there's lots of seniors that have to pay their rent. And so they skip meals because they can't afford it. Here in Toronto, we're not talking about what we might think in a third world country. So this is happening locally as well. And so that's on people's minds. And then the final thing I wanted to talk about is displacement. And so what that really refers to is you're in your home, and like I was the other day, or in a cottage, and suddenly there's a warning for a tornado. And fortunately, it didn't hit. But if it did, it could rip up a house. And so there's fires, and we've seen this, in different parts of Canada quite frequently. People are asked to leave their homes because there's fire nearby. There's flooding. There's tornadoes that damage homes. Just last weekend, we saw lots of news in the southern US for that. And so suddenly, people have to leave, and they have to leave quickly. Well, that affects, of course, anyone at any age. But what about people who have limited mobility? I was actually looking around, and people weren't really running from their homes with this tornado warning. I'm sure they all got the same thing, but they probably had cars. But an older person may not be driving anymore. And often in these cases, it's seniors who are often living alone, isolated, not getting warnings, not being able to move for a variety of reasons, or being, in heat waves, et cetera, are often found in their homes alone, who may have died on their own in isolation. If you're asked to leave in a hurry, if you're a younger person, maybe you're not on any medications. If you're older, you probably do have to leave, and suddenly you're in, a displacement center, and there's no pharmacy nearby. So one would always want to make sure that you have your medications with you, with perhaps an extra supply for easy access should this occur. If you're in a displacement center, it's noisy, it's crowded, and as you get older, sleep becomes more fragmented, and people are more prone to challenges when you're not sleeping properly. And older people are more prone to that. So there's lots of things for all ages with displacement, but there's some specific things for seniors should this occur in your area. And so those are some of the highlights that I just wanted to bring up. The good news is that, we all need to act, no matter what age, younger and older people. There are things to do, as you mentioned, making sure, being aware about changes in physiology to stay hydrated, be aware of medications you're taking and how that could be impacted by extremes of heat or cold. Public transport, is helpful. Sometimes it's a real drag when people lose their licenses for medical conditions as they get older, but you can consider the upside of, with better public transport, we can actually help the environment. So there is some positivity there. And so I'll just finish off by saying thanks for listening, and special thanks to the Canadian Association of Physicians for the Environment, who've kind of inspired me to get more interested in this field. And I will stop there.
Thank you so much, Dr. Mehta. I'm going to introduce our next presenter. So Dr. Anthony Levitt is the chief of Hurvitz Brain Sciences program at Sunnybrook, which is driving innovation and treatment in brain health. He is also a scientist with the Hurvitz Brain Science Research Program at Sunnybrook Research Institute. His research and clinical interest is in mood disorders. Dr. Levitt is also the medical director of the Family Navigation Project, a free community-based service that helps families with a youth who is suffering from a mental illness and or addiction connect with specialized services. In addition to these roles, Dr. Levitt is a professor in the Department of Psychiatry at the University of Toronto. We are so glad he is here this evening to share his expert knowledge. Without further ado, I'll pass the microphone over to you, Anthony.
Thank you very much. Can you hear me okay? All right, so I'm going to talk about climate change anxiety. Is it something or is it nothing? And I just have to advance the slide. Okay, I'm going to talk about 4 areas here. Why be anxious about climate change? What are the existing models that talk about the impact, psychological impact of climate change? How I became an accidental eco-tourist. And finally, a survey we did on climate change anxiety, which I hope will give you a perspective of what this is about. For those of you who have read Jared Diamond's work, Guns, Germs and Steel and Collapse, some of this information I'm about to talk about will be second nature, but he's a totally brilliant scientist who's written these two amazing books. And I want to start by talking about Easter Island. This is a photo of the barren landscape of Easter Island. And this is a photograph of the Maui. You've probably seen these in Sesame Street, but also these remarkable stone figures which are littered all over the island. This is an ahu, which is a stone platform carved and with all the Mauis sitting on top of it. And this is the actual state that they were found, toppled over. This is the one mine or rocky area in the whole island where these figures were formed, and you can actually see in here that they're already forming and carving a figure, and then it had to be transported to other parts of the island. So Easter Island was settled by Polynesians somewhat before 900. You may be wondering, this has to do with climate change anxiety. I'm getting there. It was settled before 900, and the land was cleared for agriculture. They had crops and chickens and wild animals and birds and plenty of fish in the sea around. It was successful, and at its peak, there was 30,000 population on this small island. And the island was divided into 12 clans or kingdoms that cooperated to share resources. These Mauis were considered an enigma for centuries, but the archaeological and historical evidence suggests that these were built as monuments to the clans and by the religious leaders, and they were, they were there to protect the clan, and they were and they competed with each other who had the most impressive Maui. Although they did collaborate on that mining site where there was the only place to get the stone for them. So, this is the largest Maui, and it was approximately 32 feet tall and weighed 75 tons. Imagine having to carve that, drag that, make that stand up with no modern technology. So the question was always, how are they transported, and why were they left half made and most were toppled over? And it turns out that these Mauis required a tremendous amount of resource to move across the island to erect. They had to use ropes made from fibrous tree bark, so they had to cut down trees for that purpose. And these canoe ladders they built had to be built from trees, and they rolled them over these tree ladders as they took them to their sites. And this led to the complete deforestation for agriculture and increasingly huge figures. And with the deforestation, there was wind erosion. There was a lack of shelter for the crops, so they didn't have crops. There was no wood boats. Hang on a second. I just got this. Sorry. So there was no wood for boats, and they had loss of food source. The birds needed the trees, and the trees are all cut down. And there was overfishing close to the shoreline because they couldn't get the boats out. And by 1500, there were no more Mauis being made. There was no trees. There was loss of social order. There was chaos. Cannibalism emerged. And by 1872, when the French colonists arrived, there were only 111 islanders left. In short, the island had collapsed. And in fact, when they came ashore, the islanders were saying this word over and over and over, and the French colonists didn't know what the word was. The word was wood. So that's what Easter Island looks like now, completely denuded. Here's another environmental photo, a bit more lush and a bit more beautiful and lovely variegated colors, but actually this is a forest in BC, and those trees are pines in various states of death. So the yellow ones are almost dying, and the purpley black ones are dead, and these have died from the pine beetle. And the pine beetle is it probably developed with pine trees, but the issue about the pine beetles is that they've currently destroyed more than 80% of British Columbia's pine forest, and the only solution to halting its inevitable path to destruction of the boreal forest is cold snap of less than 30 degrees that lasts for a couple of days. And with global warming, we are not seeing this cold snap, and this will lead to the deforestation of Canada and some believe very similar consequences to what's happening or what happened in Easter Island. So that's why it's reasonable to be anxious about climate change, but what are the psychological models that talk about the impact? And I'm not actually going to spend almost any time on that. And the reason are they're quite complicated. I'm not going to go through the slide just to show you quite complicated. But essentially, I'm going to talk about how I became an ecotourist, and then I'm going to talk about this climate change anxiety. So in May 2014, the Globe and Mail had an article which they talked about climate change, and they interviewed me. And I really was at that point, probably still now, I was not an expert on either climate change or climate anxiety. But I made this statement. This is the quote. Dr. Anthony Levitt, Sunnybrook Health Science Centre Director of Research in the Department of Psychiatry, agrees climate change anxiety increasingly enters into the discussions he has with many of the young people who come to see him. For most people who are anxious about climate change, the anxiety is escalated by the fact they do not see an answer or a way to make a change. Worry plus powerlessness leads to distress, says Levitt. The answer on a personal basis to this kind of helpless distress is mastery. That is, helping people to master small tasks that reduce their carbon footprint can lead to a greater sense of control and efficacy for that person. And with that, a reduction in anxiety, he said. So I thought this was kind of a sensible thing to say, but honestly, I had no information. I was just basically basing this on what I'd seen and how I'd spoken to my patients. But it garnered attention from an unexpected source, the Maddox Joly Pitt Foundation. I don't know if you know who that is, but here's a photo of the founder, Angelina Jolie, and her adopted Cambodian son, Maddox. And they called me to say, you know, what did I know about climate change anxiety, and that they had seen tremendous anxiety amongst Cambodian farmers. And I was quite embarrassed to say, well, it was just a perspective. Just a comment I made. I'm not a researcher. I haven't done it. So I figured maybe I should research it. And so I did. And I have many questions in the study, but I'm going to ask these 4 questions tonight. Is there such a thing as anxiety related to perceived climate change? What factors are associated with such a relationship? Specifically, is it an age factor? Is it a gender factor? Is it a geography factor? Do knowledge, attitudes, personal experience affect this possible association? And does it have anything to do? Does a depression or anxiety about climate change affect what action people take? So I'm going to talk about this slide. We took a representative sample. The study. We took a representative sample of subjects in the United States and Canada, and we had enough subjects to be able to make comments across the province and across the countries. And we had approximately 1,000 people in the US and 1,000 people in Canada. Oh, and we used SurveyMonkey, which is, everyone knows now, but at that time was somewhat unusual to use it for an epidemiological survey. We developed the climate change questionnaire, which has 7 sections, just the details of who people are, their knowledge about climate change, their attitudes and beliefs, any personal experience they've had, their emotional reaction to climate change, particularly anxiety, and then any personal action or response they've had to climate change, and finally, a sense of general well-being. This is not a very meaningful slide, but it's an important slide to show you. This is just a measure of the internal consistency, how valuable it was, this questionnaire from a psychometric, from a measurement perspective. And from a measurement perspective, we look at this thing called a Cronbach alpha, and that line there you see is drawn at 0.7. Anything above 0.7 is considered excellent, and every one of those 7 scales had excellent validity. So first question, is there such a thing as anxiety related to perceived climate change? And what the first thing we asked was how worried were they about climate change? And about 30%, almost 33%, were very worried about climate change. About 25 to 27% were thought about climate change frequently. about 36 or 37% were very concerned about future climate. And if you took those people together that had high scores on these three scales, 17.8%, let's call it 18%, had very high scores of anxiety in those three scales. And the next question we said, okay, does that anxiety make you dysfunctional in your life in any way? And so if someone had very high anxiety scores and it made them dysfunctional, that was 13% of the population. And finally, we said, have you sought treatment, or should you have sought treatment for this level of dysfunction? And that came out to be 5%. So 5% had all the above criteria, the three levels of anxiety and dysfunction, and had sought help or knew they needed to. So we were quite surprised. We did not anticipate that 5% of the population would have this level of dysfunction. That's kind of like almost the same rates as asthma. Now, I can't prove to you that that actually exists, but it was certainly more than we anticipated. So is age, gender, or geography a factor? And here's what you saw across the age range. There was low levels in those who are above 60, the highest levels in the 30 to 44-year-olds. And you see that kind of curve starting low in young people and very young people, and then in the transitional age and 30s to 40s, the levels are high. So age is definitely a factor in climate change anxiety. In terms of sex, the red bars are females, the blue bars are males, and there were three significant differences. So women were more likely to feel very or extremely concerned about the future because of climate change. Women were more likely to be very or extremely sad because of climate change than males, and females are more likely to be very or extremely worried about climate change compared to males. So there was both an age and a sex effect. And by country, you see in the red is Canada, in the blue is the United States, and on every single measure, whether it affected your daily function, how sad you were, thinking about it, being worried, on every score, Canadians were scored higher and were significantly higher than our colleagues in the United States. What I don't show here, that even in both Canada and the United States, the concerns about climate change were greater on the coasts and lower in central regions. All significantly different. So does depression or anxiety about climate change affect what action people take? Well, it does, but I'm going to show you this overall model here. And this is what's called a regression analysis to see what factors predicted climate change anxiety. And you see actually the largest predictor, predicting almost half of all variability in anxiety, almost half of the occurrence of anxiety, was personal experience regarding climate change. So the more likely you were to have had or believed that you had a personal experience with climate change, the more anxious you were. Attitudes and beliefs, of course, were important, and knowledge about climate change were important. These were equally important as each other. Not just knowledge about facts, but your beliefs about the facts. And there is some relationship between the personal action one's prepared to take and one's anxiety. In other words, the more anxious a person is about climate change, the more likely they are to take personal action. And the more anxious someone is, the more likely they are to want their government to take general action. So in summary, a surprising proportion of the population, almost 1 in 3, reports significant anxiety, and about 1 in 20 have a syndromal anxiety, almost the level of a disorder, as a result of their perceptions of climate change. Climate change is more important to Canadians, and Canadians tend to be more anxious and depressed about climate change than our US brethren. Females tend to be more anxious than males. I didn't show this, but I just want to mention it here, that climate change anxiety is not just about general well-being. It wasn't because people were just anxious, they were anxious about climate change. In fact, if you look here at this, I didn't show you this on this table, general well-being was not related, it was not a predictor of climate change anxiety. So it's not just about generally being upset or miserable, anxious. It is specifically anxiety about climate change. So what are we going to do? And there's the push and the pull. In this slide, I've turned it around to the pull and the push. What pulls us to change our behavior when it comes to climate change is our beliefs and attitudes. And unfortunately, beliefs and attitudes are very difficult to change, as we're seeing around the world and in politics particularly. Knowledge can put the knowledge about all the real concerns can pull people into behavior change. And this notion of altruism, the sense of doing good for mankind or for the world. There are things that push us into behavior change. So anticipatory anxiety, being anxious about what is happening and what might happen is something that pushes us. Noxious consequences. So Dr. Mehta being concerned about being hit by a tornado or being hit by a tornado might make him more likely to be engaged in behavior change regarding our carbon footprint. And social conformity, although that's the desire to conform with people. As we see more and more people taking action, we conform. So my question is, what do we do? And as I said in the last, when I was talking about the last slide, if we want to change behavior to reduce the impact on our carbon footprint, we need to change attitudes and beliefs, encourage altruism, allow people to experience noxious consequences, and encourage social conformity. These are all, they're difficult. They're not impossible, but they're difficult. Or we can harness anxiety. And that may seem a funny thing to be saying from someone who's a psychiatrist, who often treats people who have quite disabling anxiety. But if we can harness anxiety, anxiety is one of the strongest possible motivations for change. It's an unpleasant feeling and it's a driver. And if we can increase each person's personal sense of climate change. So Dr. Mehta experienced that Amber Alert as a personal experience of climate change. And as we showed in that study, the more people feel they're personally connected to climate change, the more likely they have anxiety, and therefore the more likely they are to change. We need to allow people to be anxious. That, again, sounds like a funny thing to be saying, but take news reporting. Like the report Dr. Mehta showed in India, we talk about records, the worst in 50 years. It almost sounds like we're glorifying what's happening. Instead, the news reporting should be on how terrible it is, how frightening it is, and how problematic it is. Allow people to be anxious. We need to provide a wider range of personal action choices. So there was a book by a journalist in Toronto. Her name was Farquharson. I think Suzanne Farquharson. And it's called Sleeping Naked is Green. But actually, it's a book where every day of the year she did something different to reduce her carbon footprint, and it's a catalog of certain things we can do. I actually once asked 680 News that has the business on the 9s and the weather on the 10s or whatever it is. I said maybe you could have a climate change some recommendations on the 13s, and but they declined my kind offer. And then we need to disseminate knowledge and facts. It is true, the more knowledge someone has, the more anxious they're going to be and the more likely they are to act. So if I have succeeded, if I have what I've said has resulted in you being slightly more anxious about climate change after this talk, then my job is done. My hope is to make you not dysfunctionally anxious, but motivated. And anxiety is one way to do it. I'll leave you with this cartoon, which says, I can definitely attest to being unnerved by some of our findings.
Thank you, Anthony, for your presentation. Just a reminder to everyone participating to please send us your questions online if you have one. You can submit your questions through our Speaker Series website. Now I have the pleasure of introducing our final speaker for today's event, Dr. Samir Mubaraka is an infectious disease physician and medical microbiologist at Sunnybrook and a clinician scientist at Sunnybrook Research Institute. Dr. Mubaraka is perhaps known for helping to isolate the SARS-CoV-2 virus during the early days of the COVID-19 pandemic, which aided researchers in developing better diagnostic testing, treatments, and vaccines. She is also an associate professor at the Department of Laboratory Medicine and Pathobiology at the University of Toronto. In addition, Dr. Mubaraka holds an applied public health chair, which is focused on using a One Health lens to examine the interconnections between humans, animals, and the environment, and ways to prevent zoonotic pathogen spillover between species. We are very pleased that Dr. Mubaraka is able to participate on our panel and to share her leading edge research and unique perspective with us. And with that, Samira, over to you.
Thank you very much, Jenny, and thank you very much to the two speakers and panelists who have gone before me. I regret to say I think I'm only going to add to people's climate anxiety, but perhaps that will amplify Dr. Lovett's practice as well as his message. Bonsoir à tous et à toutes. En cas où il y a des Franco-Ontariens parmi nous, ça me fait beaucoup plaisir d'être parmi vous ce soir. So I'll start by talking a little bit about the One Health approach. It's a complex concept that in many ways people are probably more familiar with than they think. So One Health is an approach to complex problems, climate change being one of them, other ecosystem stressors, which I will talk about tonight as well as climate change. And the reason that these are so complex is because of the interdependence between many of the variables that might lead to nefarious threats like infectious diseases. And I think we learned a lot about this during the pandemic. If we think about SARS coronavirus 2, the virus that was responsible for the pandemic, it was the first coronavirus pandemic. We're used to thinking about pandemics as, influenza pandemics, cholera pandemics, but this was really the first time we had dealt with a coronavirus pandemic. And so it came from a place that we really are not very familiar with, and that's a wildlife reservoir. When we think about influenza viruses, we think about wildlife reservoirs as well, but we tend to think about agricultural animals as well as potential reservoirs where viruses can spill over. And the reality is all of these systems are connected. They're all interdependent. Much of it is based on the way that we behave and how we've structured our societies. So obviously we live in rural settings, urban settings, mobile communities. And we also interact through the animals that we tend to live with or otherwise interact with in a manner that might not be obvious. And we'll talk about some examples as we go on. Of course, all of us share an environment or an ecosystem. So all living things share this really critical infrastructure, really, and it's a health infrastructure. So remember during the pandemic, we were talking about first line providers. Well, if we start to think about the environment and our shared ecosystems as a fundamental resource that we require in order to be healthy, and think of it as our first line defense against infectious diseases, that might be one way that we can kind of integrate and understand how ecosystems relate directly to our health. And that's what the One Health approach really advocates for. And this is a formal definition that was developed by the World Health Organization about One Health and how it encompasses the health of humans, domestic animals, wildlife, also plants, importantly, and the wider environment. And really, to address problems that are related to One Health, we need to mobilize multiple sectors, we need disciplines to work together, and we need communities to work together. So if you're wondering where this came from, a lot of it is really based on some concepts that are fairly familiar to those who've been working in the global health sector. So these are the Sustainable Development Goals, which will be very familiar to many people who work in global health. And One Health really emerged from many of these goals because they are so interdependent. So life below water and life on land are very, very closely related to climate action, for example. And then the Wildlife Conservation Society brought these concepts together in many ways with what they called the Manhattan Principles that have now been revised into the Berlin Principles to really give us a basis or a framework that we can work in to understand One Health. So I know that sounds very theoretical and conceptual, and so we'll dig into a couple of good examples or scenarios just so that it consolidates these concepts for you. And we'll start with a bird's eye view of some of these fairly complex systems, but I'll take you through just maybe one or two examples so that you get a sense of how these systems fit together. And maybe we'll start at the bottom here. So there are a number of infectious diseases, and I've been talking about pandemic infections, but there are so many other potential pathogens. So if we start over here, for example, thinking about soil-borne diseases, a lot of the fungal diseases that we deal with actually are part of, or their reservoir is in the environment. So blastomycosis, for example, is a dimorphic fungus that is here in Ontario that can cause a number of different syndromes, including pulmonary syndromes and meningitis and meningoencephalitis. There are also foodborne diseases like salmonella, listeria, etc. Waterborne diseases. We often hear about cholera outbreaks, particularly in the setting of extreme climate events or socio-political disruption. Vector-borne diseases, many people are very familiar with West Nile virus, and there are many other vector-borne, so vectors are mosquitoes or ticks, diseases that are emerging globally. Dengue is causing massive amounts of infections currently because of the widespread promiscuity of the vectors themselves, the mosquitoes. Rodent-borne diseases are quite important as well. We're seeing increase in those, particularly in places in urban centers because of that human-animal interface. And then airborne diseases like respiratory infections. And just to show a couple of examples of how these can really lead to how different climate change precipitants can lead to some of these diseases. If, for example, we look at extreme weather events, increased temperature, change that then affects the reproduction of vectors. So again, vectors are ticks, they're mosquitoes. That changes the replication cycle of these ticks or mosquitoes. And you start to see increased intrusion into human habitats that we hadn't seen before. And then you get human exposure to things like West Nile virus and others. Why is this happening? That is a question that is incredibly complex and will take many disciplines to come together to answer. But one of the things that really has gained a lot of focus recently is a concept called land use induced spillover. And I thank Dr. Levitt for giving the example at the top of his talk around Easter Island, because that is one extreme example of land use. And in our setting, in the infectious diseases setting, that can lead to what we call spillover. So when we talk about spillover, it's about pathogens going from their natural reservoir or habitat over into a reservoir that is not normally exposed, or a host that is not normally exposed that might be very susceptible to disease. So if it spills over into another animal that doesn't exhibit any disease, you might get cryptic transmission and you don't realize that this pathogen's been circulating until it starts to cause severe disease. So if you look here on the left, you see this beautiful pristine forest, and in that forest, there are viruses that are in their natural niches. They're dispersed, they're not highly concentrated, and there's a degree of immunity, both within the host that those viruses will reside in, but also at the level of the landscape, because you don't have high concentrations of particular reservoir. They're sort of spread out. Now, what happens when you start to disrupt these ecosystems or these ecotones, you start to break down that landscape immunity. So you might start to see concentrations, for example, of rodents in unusually high populations, perhaps because their predators, so larger mammals, are displaced because of land use and deforestation and human incursions. So you're left with places where, there might be more rodents that harbor certain pathogens. And with those incursions come humans. So now we're bringing humans into proximity with reservoirs that they normally wouldn't be exposed to. So we think about bats as a very important reservoir as well. And that's certainly one of the things that's been implicated in spillover events for viruses like Ebola, SARS coronavirus 2, and the first SARS coronavirus that had emerged back in the earlier 2000s. And then ultimately, you sort of lose that edge. And ultimately, when you have a fully urban environment, then the risk of exposure goes down again because you've essentially eliminated so many of the reservoirs. Not that that is a solution in any way whatsoever, because many other problems ensue. So just see if there we go. So this is a model of what this process entails. So it's infection of these natural reservoirs like bats. You get shedding of virus from these bats, and normally they would just shed to each other, and the cycle of the virus continues, and really there's no nefarious effect. If you start with land incursion, introducing domestic species like swine, and those swine live in proximity to people, this is when you get shedding, spillover, and then potential sustained human-to-human spread. And part of the problem is the breakdown in some of the natural barriers that normally we would rely on to prevent this from happening. So breakdown in normal disease ecology is one important example, normal dynamics. When you start to see changes in the intensity of pathogen accumulation and spillover, when you start to see increases in human exposure because of that proximity or proximity dynamics, when you start to see changes in immunity, so normally people would have immunity to other human pathogens, but they may have zero or very limited immunity to animal pathogens, and if those pathogens have the opportunity to adapt, they will spill over into humans. So this is one example that's courtesy of Dr. Brock Fenton. He's a bat biologist at Western, and they've been studying this site in Belize for a very, very long time. And the first time that we went, this whole area was forested. After several years, you can see that there's been substantial amount of deforestation. So imagine all these bats that used to live, a fairly diverse population of bats living in this space, no longer have a habitat. So what that does is it changes the ecology of the reservoir or potential reservoir, the bat, significantly. Then introduce these farmed animals or livestock. So these animals are normally obviously wouldn't be present, introduced in high concentrations right next to bat habitats. Unsurprisingly, some bats take advantage of this. So this is a picture of a vampire bat. And vampire bats are what we call hematophagous. They consume blood. So what better blood meal than a very slow moving bovine that has liters and liters of blood? So they feed on these bovine species. And this is how bovine rabies gets transmitted. So, and this is just an example of a vampire bat. They look terrifying here, but this is actually the real size of an adult vampire bat. And what happens is you start to see an increased amount of shedding, not only from the bats to each other because they're proliferating, but also into the bovine species or into the cows. So this is obviously of substantial concern, not only for animal health, but for human health as well. Adele, how am I doing for timing? Or Jenny, I should ask.
I think you're doing great.
Okay, thank you. So I'll just take a little bit of time to also talk about arboviruses, which are another important climate-sensitive pathogen. And this is a really nice review that Vicky Ning had produced in CCDR, the Canadian Communicable Diseases Report. And rather than going into the detailed data, I'm just going to show this nice abstract that she put together. So what kind of diseases do we need to worry about when we think about arboviruses or vector-borne diseases? And so we think about ones that are transmitted by mosquitoes and ticks. But for example, mosquitoes are featured very prominently here. And dengue was one of them we mentioned already, but also malaria is a major pathogen worldwide. Yellow fever, Zika virus, chikungunya, all of these have circulated in fairly high abundance in recent years. And they're transmitted by all these different species of mosquitoes. And these species of mosquitoes are not endemic in Canada normally, but they could become established if there is a conducive ecosystem. So we're seeing the vector range creep north gradually, and we're starting to identify more and more exotic mosquito species that didn't exist here before. And this is very concerning. What's driving this? Increases in temperature, variability in precipitation, increased humidity, extreme weather events. And just a little bit more specifically, how this happens is when you have mosquitoes that are introduced into a warmer environment that is conducive to their development, you see more larvae, so more mosquitoes. They live longer. They don't have, they feed more often because the accelerated egg development drives their metabolism. The viruses have shorter incubation period, and there might be a whole host of other potential reasons that these vectors are able to transmit pathogens more efficiently. And just to give you a sense of some of these viruses and the complexity of the interactions between virus, vector, and reservoirs, at the bottom of this slide, you can see a whole range of reservoir species for what we call orthobunya viruses. These are all here, well, most of them, not every single one, but most of them are here in Ontario. So it's really important. This is a problem that's extremely close to home. The last example I'll talk about is about highly pathogenic avian influenza virus. This virus landed in late 2021 in Canada. So it seeded the Americas from Canada, specifically the Avalon Peninsula in Newfoundland. But that was not the only incursion of this virus. A number of different incursions have happened also from the West Coast. And there's something very unique and unusual about this virus, because not only are we seeing more and sustained incursions, so usually you get sporadic outbreaks, virus comes and goes with what we call a stamping out intervention. So they depopulate poultry that get infected. This is very different now. It's persisting in wild birds. So we're getting recurrent incursions and recurrent spillovers into domestic livestock, including poultry, and we're getting recurrent reassortment. So the virus is actually changing and evolving. And what's happened now is this force of infection for this virus is so great that it started spilling over into mammals. And not only terrestrial animals like foxes and skunks, and we're seeing now cats, and probably most recently heard about cows, but also marine mammals, causing really large die-offs of sea lions and other animals in Central and South America. So how do we solve this? This is obviously an extremely complex challenge. It will take many people many years, and we need to be working on this imminently and urgently. And there are a number of intergovernmental bodies that are doing this, and we are trying to do our bit through the Wildlife Emerging Pathogen Initiative, so WildEpi. But really, it's about understanding those drivers of what's pushing pathogens to spill over into from their reservoir hosts into other species, including humans. And much of that really is about anthropogenic drivers of disease emergence. So I'll just close by saying one of the most important things that we need to think about are how to prevent and prepare for these spillovers, but prevention really should be the new focus. We've been trying to recover from the pandemic, but if we want to prevent the next one, for example, highly pathogenic avian influenza circulating in animals right now in Canada, we've depopulated over 10 million chickens infected with highly pathogenic avian influenza, but we've had no human cases at this stage that were acquired in Canada. But to prevent this and to be prepared, we need these strategic alliances, collaborative leadership, and the coordination among people who work not only in human health, but also in wildlife health and veterinary medicine. So I'll stop there.
Thank you so much, Samira. That was a really interesting presentation and may have increased my eco-anxiety just a little bit. Well, so that concludes our formal presentations. We'll now begin the question and answer portion of the speaker series. If you would like to submit a question, you can still do so. But let me kick off our session with our first question, and this can be either to Dr. Levitt or Dr. Mubaraka. The first question is, I walk every day outdoors in Toronto. Am I better on an indoor treadmill since I am not breathing car fumes? So maybe I'll open it up for both of you. Anthony, I think you're on mute if you're wanting to respond.
Sorry about that. I have 2 levels of mute, so I have to unmute both. Firstly, I'm very glad this person is walking every day. That's probably the most positive thing for their health. And if Raj has just arrived, so he may want to comment about environmental pollutants. However, that's just I don't know exactly where they're walking. But exposure to environmental light while you're exercising is generally a positive thing for health. So I would encourage that. I guess it depends what your own sensitivities are and other health issues. You have to, I guess, look at pollen count. You have to look at the pollutant count. But generally, it's healthy to be walking, and it's healthy to be walking outside.
Thank you. Maybe Dr. Mehta, I'll repeat the question if you're able to provide some comments. The question came through, I walk every day outdoors in Toronto. Am I better on an indoor treadmill since I am not breathing car fumes?
Great question. And the answer, like always, it depends. If you're stuck walking right next to traffic, if there's any options other than a major thoroughfare, a side street, whatever, where the pollution will be a little bit less, would be a better option. My view, walking outside is better for a variety of reasons. One is there tends to be a little bit of unevenness, and that's a good challenge for the brain. On a treadmill, it's regular, it's steady, and while it gets cardiovascular fitness, we don't live on a treadmill. We live in the real world. And so walking outside where there may be a little bit of unevenness, some ups and downs, requires a little bit of extra effort for the brain. And there's also more stimulation going on outside as well. So for those reasons, and I just heard the last comment about sunlight, I believe that's all a good thing. So just maybe try and avoid a main thoroughfare.
Thank you. Samira, any comments?
No, the only thing I would add to that is if you're on a treadmill, you're also consuming and using energy, unless it's, so if you're walking, you're not really adding to the problem. So that's the other thing that sometimes when I'm trying to decide what kind of exercise to do, it factors in. If I'm not using energy, I don't mean my own energy, but I mean, electricity, I'm more likely to go with an option that doesn't consume and potentially contribute to the problem.
That's a great point. Thank you. I'll move on to the second question, and maybe Dr. Mehta, maybe I'll have you start. The question is, what advice do you have for seniors living in high rises without air conditioning?
Good question as well. That's a challenge because certainly on warm days, apartments can get quite warm. So, within reason, getting a fan, if that's a possibility, would be helpful to keep the air circulating, and that can help with the convection current I was talking about earlier, which will still move air. If it becomes unbearable, being aware of where a cooling center might be in your neighborhood that actually does have air conditioning options for you. those would be my two, but that's a real concern on a really hot day.
Thank you. Any comments from the other two panelists? Okay, I'll move on to the next question. I think maybe Dr. Levitt, I'll have you start, but the question is, what advice do you have about how to talk to young people who are worried and anxious about the climate? For instance, people who don't want to start a family because they feel hopeless about the future of the planet.
So there's two parts of this in terms of what to say to young people who are anxious about the climate. My first response is we should not downplay it. We shouldn't say, oh, there's nothing to worry about. It's perfectly fine. I think that's being disingenuous, and it's actually untrue. There are things to be worried about. And those things that we are worried about, hopefully, will drive us to action. But to deny their feelings actually affects your relationship with them. They then have an issue trusting you. But the second part of the question is, I think, the most important, and that's the sense of hopelessness. There definitely is a serious issue to do with climate change. And as most scientists anticipate, there will be an inflection point where things will get to a point where we actually can't reverse what's going on. But as Jared Diamond says in his two books, as Georges Monbiot said in his books about climate change, there still is hope. And there is still hope that we can reduce our carbon footprint. It has to be a dramatic effect. We can't be tinkering anymore. It's really got to be dramatic, because otherwise we will hit that inflection point and there's not much we can do about it then. Having said that, even if you hit that inflection point, there are still things that we can do to reduce our carbon footprint, to slow that progress, and to find ways and better ways to live healthily. So I don't think there's a point of hopelessness, and I do think it's important to acknowledge anxiety, but to talk about the reality. The reality is we're in a serious situation, and the reality is we can still turn it around.
Thank you. Maybe another question onto you, Dr. Levitt. Does CBT help with climate anxiety?
Yeah, definitely. CBT was developed in the 50s and 60s to deal with depression, but it turns out it's probably the best way of dealing with climate anxiety too. And really, it's the issue of mastery. What CBT helps people to do is to take small actions to overcome thoughts and feelings that aren't healthy for them. So when it comes to climate change, we start with small actions. Yes, we need to progress to large actions, but it's got to start with small actions. And that's what CBT helps us to do. It challenges the way we think and feel about the world and ourselves, and then challenges us to do things, not just to think differently, but to do things to change that. So CBT is a great model for climate change anxiety.
Okay, thank you. Maybe I'll turn the questions to Dr. Mubaraka. So the question is, can you speak a bit about the increase in ticks we are seeing across Ontario connections to climate change? How concerned are you about this and the risk of Lyme disease?
That's certainly been a significant concern for those of us in the infectious diseases community. When I first started here in Ontario in the late 2000s, we were able to say there's no Lyme disease in Ontario. That's no longer the case. There's clearly Lyme disease here in Ontario. And the challenge with ticks is that Lyme isn't the only potential pathogen. They do carry other things as well. And so that's something that the public health agencies are increasing their surveillance for and their diagnostics for, and we're also aware of. So we are quite concerned. We certainly encourage people to take preventative measures, which often involves covering up. That's probably the most helpful thing. If you're walking in tall grasses or hiking, anything of that nature, if possible, boots, socks, sleeves, full-length pants, and then obviously any insect repellent. Do tick checks. So that's something, for example, with our kids when they were in camp, when they get home at the end of the day, tick checks. These are new things, right? That we don't normally think about, that we have to now have to consider quite seriously. There are data out there, if it's helpful. Every year the Public Health Ontario does tick dragging, and they test for Lyme, and there are maps online. So again, being aware is very important. Having the information, really important, because there are some areas of Ontario that do have more ticks. So I would encourage anyone who does spend a lot of time outdoors having a look at some of those maps on the website.
Thank you. The next question is a little bit back to Anthony. Is limiting news or doom scrolling, which can be stressful, an appropriate strategy for climate anxiety?
I'm going to answer that question, but can I ask Dr. Mubareka a question before I do? Is there an increase in ticks? And secondly, is there an increase in the proportion of ticks that carry Lyme?
The sense is yes to both. Certainly seeing more Lyme than what we had seen before, and there are regions where there are many more ticks than had been previously, both in the northeast of the United States, but also Southern Ontario is a fairly vulnerable area. It's really that front of where the geographic range of these ticks and mosquitoes are expanding. And it's also one of the most densely populated parts of Ontario. So unfortunately, yes, that is the case. But luckily, there are preventative measures that could be taken.
Okay, thank you. So I'll go back to answer the question. This notion of news cycles, we are so exposed to news cycles, much more than we ever were. I gave a talk at a high school in Toronto, and I asked the question of the youth. I said, and I had a purpose in this. I said, in 1980, there was an epidemiological survey done in Canada, and the rates of depression were determined to be 6%. 10 years later, in 1990, there was a epidemiological survey of Ontario. The rates were determined to be 18%. That's a threefold increase. And I asked them, what did they think could be possibly the reason for an increase of threefold in that time? And the first youth put up their hand and said, well, I think it's the addition of social media. And I said, well, in 1990, we didn't really have social media. We hardly even had the internet in 1990. Can you think of other things? Another student put up their hand and said, Facebook. I said, well, Facebook is part of social media, but we probably wasn't Facebook at that time. Anyone else? Someone said Instagram. Every youth wanted to tell me that the reason they think that rates of depression are high, particularly in youth, is social media. It's a preoccupation. And so youth get news through social media. We get news through social media, but also through regular media. And there is this impact. There's a dramatic impact of media on mental health and behavior. In fact, Dr. Senior at Sunnybrook has done remarkable studies showing the way we talk about suicide in the news impacts the rates of suicide in our society. We have an incredible responsibility to report things appropriately. Now, there is so much news. You can grab news 24 hours a day and night from various areas. It is possible. As I said before, a little bit of anxiety is helpful because it's motivating, but being overwhelmed by news and anxiety is can be really devastating. And it's tough. We are free to choose what we read and see. I think as an individual, if you feel overwhelmed, then making an agreement with yourself to reduce the amount of news you're watching without necessarily putting blinders on to what's going on in our environment. And that's a very difficult balance. I can't give you a recipe of exactly how to do that, but there is some balance between not exposing yourself to negative news and keeping yourself informed.
Great response. Thank you. The next question is back to Dr. Mubareka. Are there lessons from COVID-19 we should be thinking about when it comes to the One Health approach you were discussing?
Absolutely. I think if I were to summarize it in one sentence, it would be follow the virus. If you really want to know how things are connected, follow the virus. You will find out you will discover all these connections that otherwise would not have been discerned if you weren't actually tracking the virus across species. And I think when you do that kind of work, one of the fundamental messages or lessons I learned was that you have to also feel very comfortable crossing disciplines, right? And going into areas where you are clearly out of your comfort zone. So one example was before the pandemic, actually, we were looking for coronaviruses in bats. So that involves getting into a vehicle in the middle of the night, going out into the bush and trying to see these nocturnal animals, get them into a net and do some swabbing. Of course, you do this with biologists who know what they're doing. And that's how you start to understand what the ecology of the virus is and where it could also potentially be going next. And that's what we're trying to do with, for example, highly pathogenic avian influenza virus. Again, with our counterparts in the wildlife sector, we went with them when they were banding birds. And when you're banding birds, you can also swab birds. But again, very much out of the comfort zone, kilometers and kilometers away from Sunnybrook Hospital. There we are on an airboat, netting birds in the middle of the night so that they could be swabbed. And at the same time, we also sample the water because we're following the virus. We want to see if the virus is in the water that the birds are swimming in. And at some point, to really complete this story, it would be very good to also, for example, sample the humans that are handling the birds. That would be a full One Health project, right? But it takes a lot of disciplines, a lot of approvals, and a lot of resources to do that kind of work. So I could go on this topic, but I'll leave it at that because I think that illustrates a couple of good examples of some of the lessons we learned.
Thank you so much. Before we wrap up, maybe what I'll ask is final comments from our panel. Maybe each of the panel members can comment on what gives them hope, where they can find hope, despite the challenges and health impacts we know are happening due to climate change. Maybe I'll start with Dr. Mehta.
I think the fact that people are here tonight to hear about this and want to learn, and lots of education going on from a physician standpoint. I was excited about this topic, been interested, but excited to see the network of physicians across the country. And again, I encourage people to check out the website, CAPE. It is Canadian Association of Physicians for the Environment. And I've been very impressed with the work that's being done from colleagues across the country.
Thank you. Dr. Levin?
What gives me hope actually is young people. Young people really have adopted things to do with equity, diversity, and inclusion so openly and so wholeheartedly. I love the way they demand of me to include, he, she, he, him, and she, her in when I'm talking, and to be very careful to be inclusive. And they also are worried, anxious about climate change, and for good reason. And I believe they're the ones that are going to change the way we're moving. They are going to demand that we take personal action, which they are already taking, and they're going to demand that our government take general action. And so that's where I find my hope.
Thank you. And Dr. Mubaraka?
I would agree with both Dr. Mehta and Dr. Levitt, colleagues, young people, and also we're starting to see a movement towards restoring our relationships with nature and the natural world. And that's something that's being led by many Indigenous scholars. And we're hearing much more in terms of their voices and their perspectives that really underscores the interconnections between us and the natural world. And I think if we reconnect with the natural world, A, we'll care about it more, and B, it will restore our hope.
Thank you. Okay, I think we've answered all the questions, so maybe we will conclude our Q&A. So before we wrap up, I just want to make sure that we take a moment for you to fill out your electronic evaluation form. This form will help us in planning future talks and topics for you. You can also add your name to our mailing list for future talks by emailing speaker.series@sunnybrook.ca. I'd like to thank our speakers once again for their incredibly informative event. Thank you to Martha Torrey from the Sunnybrook Board of Directors for offering welcoming remarks this evening. And a big thank you to all of you for joining this educational event. Please be sure to check out our upcoming topics, which will be shared on our speaker series website, and have a wonderful night. Thank you.